Welcome to Sparks of History, where Jewish history and world history meet. We are very honored and pleased to have with us today Rabbi Dr. Eli Rubin. In addition to receiving rabbinic ordination smicha, Rabbi Rubin received a PhD from the Department of Hebrew and Jewish Studies at the University College of London. Rabbi Rubin is a contributing editor to the very, very popular Chabad.org platform, and his articles on the intellectual and social history of Chabad Hasidism have appeared in numerous academic journals and publications, such as AGS Review, Shofar, Jewish Currents, and Lehrhaus. Rabbi Rubin was a co-author of Social Vision, the Lubavitcher Rebbe's transformative paradigm for the world. And today we will be discussing Rabbi Rubin's seminal and fascinating work, Kabbalah and the Rupture of Modernity, an existential history of Chabad Hasidism, which is forthcoming from Stanford University Press, but has received acclaim. For example, Professor Susanna Heschel of Dartmouth College writes, Rabbi Rubin's book offers an exciting new way of thinking about Jewish modernity, making this one of the most original and interesting books in Jewish studies of our time. Professor Yehuda Mirsky of Brandeis University has written Chabad's rich intellectual history and its place in the broad existential currents of modernity finally get their due with Rabbi Rubin's stupendous book, which, like its author, is a wonder of erudition, insight, and humility. So we can get going and see what
thank you very much for inviting me. I'm very glad to talk about the book, and after such an introduction, I just hope I can do some justice to it.
God willing. Just to start, what exactly is the idea and concept of ṣimṣum in original Kabbalah understanding?
So, ṣimṣum is a really an ancient idea. It can be traced all the way back to Midrashic literature. We just read a couple of weeks ago in the Torah, Parshat Truma, where you have the description of the Aron Ha'edos, the Ark, the Holy Ark, which is in the sanctuary in the Holy of Holies. And in the Medrash, we find the term ṣimṣum in that context, that God contracted his Shekhinah, his indwelling, his revelation, between the Badei Ha'aron, between the staves of the ark, the staves that were used to carry the ark. So we have this notion of God being God who is immense, God who is infinite, being made present in a very small and contained space. So that's the original, that's the earliest place where we find the term ṣimṣum. But the idea, as it's come down to us in modernity, is really refracted through the prism of Kabbalah, beginning with medieval Kabbalah. The Ramban uses the term ṣimṣum, but most importantly, the Arizal, he used ṣimṣum in a way that no Kabbalist before him had used ṣimṣum. This is a matter of some debate amongst scholars, but how exactly to interpret it. It's also a debate amongst Kabbalists, how exactly to interpret it. And that's a large part, at least the early chapters of my book, gets into some of the thorny debates and controversies in the pre-Hasidic period, and also amongst academic scholars today, more recently. But the way I would characterize the notion of ṣimṣum as it's come down to us is in a way the opposite of the ancient notion of ṣimṣum, which is, as opposed to the ancient notion of ṣimṣum being about contracting God in a small contained place in the Holy of Holies between the staves of the Aron, between the staves of the Ark. Now we have this notion of ṣimṣum as a removal of God or a withdrawal of God, because, again, going back to this idea of God's infinitude, because God is infinite, there can be no room for anything else to exist. Therefore, according to the Arizal, in order to create the worlds, in order for anything else to be at all, really for any kind of concept other than the single concept of divine being, to have any coherence, God has to withdraw or conceal, depending on how you interpret it, his infinite presence, his infinite assertion of self, and create a space that's empty, as it were, of divine being or of divine revelation, again, subject to debate, in order that in that space, other entities can emerge, can be created, can be emanated, can be given form, can be given coherence, can acquire a sense of self, other, separate, independent of God. And so this is a kind of foundational explanation of being itself, of reality itself.
So it's trying to solve the problem that is trying to solve is this notion, assumption, or truth that because God is infinite, God encompasses all of reality, the entire world. Is that an assumption that is accepted by all?
The assumption of God is infinite?
Because God is infinite,
Yeah.
there isn't any space for anything else unless we come to ṣimṣum, which solves that problem.
Right. Well, broadly speaking, that's the accepted way of thinking about this. The later Kabbalists after Arizal do debate what exactly this assumption itself means. Right. So some Kabbalists will make the argument that if you have they give the parable of a light, physical light. So you have a flame, a candle burning in a room that sheds light, and it fills the whole space of the room with light. But that doesn't mean there's no room for any other things, right? And you can bring another light, a second light, and then you'll add more light. So, but other Kabbalists will argue that this analogy doesn't hold, we kind of extrapolate from this analogy to the case of God because the light of a candle is not infinite, right? So one of the problems here is that it's very difficult for us to conceive of infinitude. Do we mean just that it fills all space, or do we mean something much more powerful, something much more essential about the way that God asserts or the absoluteness of God? Light, physical light, is just one thing. It's actually a very limited thing. So it doesn't have the characteristic of infinitude. Even if you would have an infinite flow of physical light, it wouldn't be infinite in the way that God is infinite, right? It would still just be light, and it wouldn't be trees. It wouldn't be water. It would be light, right? So it's inherently limited in its very being. Whereas when we talk about God's infinitude, we're talking about the absolute foundation, the source, or prior to even being a source for any other things. There is just one thing, right? And that's the notion of infinity that Arizal seems really to be talking about, is this not a mathematical infinity, not a spatial infinity, but an infinite being, a being that is the most absolute, the most fundamental, and which is complete, which doesn't need anything else, and which doesn't allow for even the concept. For example, the Kabbalists will say wisdom. Wisdom is the highest of all the sefirot, right? Chachma. So wisdom itself is a particular thing. It's a concept. We have when we use the term wisdom and say, let's say we would say God is wise, that would be to label God in a particular way. But God, as God is in God's fundamental self, is beyond any such labels, any such characteristics, beyond any. There are no such concepts as wisdom, kindness. These are all, from the Kabbalistic perspective, these are all beyond the realm of infinitude. They must be created in this space that's been emptied of God's infinitude in order for them to have any coherence. Otherwise, even if God holds within his infinite capacity these qualities, they are just lost. They are flooded by the infinite radiance of God's fundamental being. They have no coherence. They are so transparent to the infinite that they cannot be seen or identified as particular concepts or particular qualities at all. So ṣimṣum is, in a way, it's the event that allows us to begin to think, right? To begin to have language, to talk. Even before there's any things, the concept of things, right? The concept of there being God and something else. That concept comes into being, as it were, through ṣimṣum.
Historically, as we move from the Arizal in Tzfat in the 16th century, we're moving now to the advent of Hasidism in the 18th century. How does the concept of ṣimṣum develop? And the Vilna Gaon's opposition to Hasidim, how did ṣimṣum play a role in that opposition?
So when it comes to the early generations of Hasidism, one of the very fundamental ideas that we have is that God is everywhere. Now it's become popularized in a children's song, Hashem is here, Hashem is there, Hashem is truly everywhere. And it's become almost universally accepted as axiomatic Jewish theology. But in the Baal Shem Tov's time, and even before the Baal Shem Tov, this was a matter of debate, because the notion of ṣimṣum, if it's understood literally, is in fact that God is not present in the world, and that God's infinitude cannot countenance, cannot allow for God to be present in the world. Some also argued that it's the problem with thinking that God is present in the world is a matter of respect to God. If we are to think of God as being this great, holy, perfect entity, to say that God is sullied, is dirtied by being found in this lowly world, in a world of sin, in a world of all kinds of unholiness, right? Is to taint God, is to disrespect God. And the parable given by some Kabbalists is of a king. They say it's preferable to think of the king as gazing through a window upon a pile of refuse rather than thinking God is in the pile of refuse. But the Chassidim, they maintained that, on the contrary, God is present, even as it were, in the refuse, even in this unholy, lowly, in the world, in the failings of human activities. God is present there too. So this was a very radical idea, because for some, that could be seen as potentially legitimizing sin, or it really, in a sense, it kind of breaks down the boundaries of holiness, and brings by bringing the holy into every area of life, even into the less ideal areas of life. That would seem to degrade or even undo the very category of holiness itself. If everything is holy, then nothing is holy. So this did become a very fundamental matter of debate. And I think part of why it was so important in Hasidism, even though it had been a debate amongst Kabbalists on a more cerebral, intellectual level beforehand, was that with Hasidism, these ideas came out of the academy, as it were. They came out of the elite groups of Kabbalists, and they were being taught in a more popular way, and they were acquiring a kind of social weight. People were starting to live differently, to practice differently, and the early Hasidim believed that these ideas could inspire people, but the recognition of God's presence everywhere could inspire people to enhance their relationship with God, to enhance their commitment to Torah study, to enhance the quality of their prayers, to enhance the vitality and excitement with which they perform mitzvot. So the Chassidim, in teaching these ideas more openly, and also in more popular terms, not in the kind of scholarly or abstract Kabbalistic philosophical terms, but using homilies, right? Divrei Torah. The Hasidic teachings would take a pasuk from the Chumash, from the Parsha of the week, and interpret it in light of these Kabbalistic ideas. So that made them much more accessible. And you now had large numbers of people who were beginning to embrace a new way of relating to God, which was inspired by, infused with this way of thinking about reality, about God, and the connection between God and reality. And so some people, most famously the Gaon of Vilna, who was himself a Kabbalist and who inherited or was continued a strand of Kabbalistic interpretation that was more conservative, but also regarded God as being fundamentally transcendent and out of reach of humanity, except in very limited ways. They came to regard the Hasidic interpretation of ṣimṣum as heretical.
What was it? Was the position there, for example, of the Gaon of Vilna, Rebbe Eliyahu, was that because of this new way of looking at the world, reality, God, ṣimṣum, that's what caused, in his eyes, in the Gaon's eyes, Hasidism to say it's more important to pray with pure intention than to pray on time. It's more important to sing and dance than to learn. Did he see that as being a causal connection between one and the two? In other words, if the Hasidim had come with this reality as a hashkafa, as in theory, without making any changes as were perceived by the Gaon, would the dispute have been different?
Well, I think in the early generations of Hasidism, certainly in the Gaon of Vilna's own time, the changes were very slight, and the Chassidim did have did make their own separate minyanim, and they used the nusach Sfard, the nusach Arizal. But we don't find complaints in the edicts or the charamim, which were written in the 1770s, 1780s. We don't find a great emphasis on changes in practice or complaints that they're transgressing halacha. That does not seem to have been the main concern. What seems to have been the principal concern was a change in ethos, and that ethos was underpinned by a metaphysics, by a philosophy, by a set of theological beliefs. And it seems to me that it was primarily with these theological beliefs that the Gaon took issue. The Gaon took issue with, there's a scholar, Maz Kahana, who has shown that there was an attempt during this period by the Vilna Gaon and also the Noda B'Yehuda to purify halacha of its Kabbalistic influences. So you can connect it to that, but the changes in halachic practice were not introduced by the Chassidim. They had been going on amongst Kabbalistic elites for a long time, and they weren't contested. The Noda B'Yehuda himself practiced some of these Kabbalistic innovations which were introduced into halachic practice, things like in Nusach HaTfilah, and he also embraced many key ideas that were important to the Chassidim, but what he was opposed to was translating this into a populistic ethos. So it was okay for someone like him or elite scholars and Aklois who were deeply immersed in study of the Lurianic writings and also in pietistic practices. That was something that he was not opposed to in principle, but he didn't think that these considerations, these Kabbalistic considerations, should influence psak, legislation for as a norm for how to run a community, to run it. So in his synagogue, they did not adopt the practices. These were private practices that he might have practiced himself, but he did not establish them as the right, as part of the nusach, right, or as part of the general practice in the synagogues that he led, or in the communities that he led. Right? So there was a part of the issue here was not so much the practices themselves, but the connection to, and for the Vilna Gaon, certainly he writes explicitly that he understands these ideas as heresy. So the ideas fundamentally are heretical, married with practice on a popular level as a kind of widespread social phenomenon. That was the thing that really seemed to rouse opposition.
And now we have with Shneur Zalman of Liadi, the Baal HaTanya. How does ṣimṣum move down in its understanding as we reach now the Tanya, the first Rebbe of Chabad? How does it change?
So the thing about Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi is that he was a kind of Renaissance man who was able to take diverse fields of study, halacha, Kabbalah, and also the ethical Musar literature, and synthesize it with tremendous clarity. So while in previous generations, in the time of his teacher, the Maggid Mezrich, or in the time of the Baal Shem Tov, the Hasidic ethos was expressed in a much more informal and much more kind of ad hoc form, and it was centered around these charismatic figures, the Baal Shem Tov himself, and there were many other similar charismatic figures in the Baal Shem Tov's time, and the Maggid and his great students. All of them were charismatic figures who were able to communicate, and their teachings were seen as spontaneous revelations almost, which had the capacity to really fire people up, and which had a tremendous pull, a tremendous ability to make people see things differently, see themselves differently, see the world differently. Rabbi Shneur Zalman took those ideas and read them back into the more classical, scholarly, literary corpus of Lurianic Kabbalah, which is Lurianic Kabbalah is written often very tersely. It's complicated. It's almost, some scholars have compared it to like scientific manuals or encyclopedias. It's very detailed, right? It's almost like reading a manual, an instruction manual about the heavens, about the celestial world, the mechanics of the celestial world. And so it's very inaccessible to regular people. But it is, on the other hand, quite systematic. So what the Alter Rebbe did, Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi, first and foremost in the Tanya, was that he read the new Hasidic ethos back into the Lurianic texts and presented it in a form that was both systematic, accessible, for not just for people who are deeply immersed in Kabbalistic literature, but also for regular Talmidei Chachamim, right? So regular, people, let's say, they call them the secondary elite, is the scholarly term for it. People who weren't necessarily rabbis, people who weren't necessarily great scholars, but who had some learning, right? Who had been in yeshiva, or had made it to the top class in their local cheder, and who may have been businessmen, who may have been shoichdim, like lower level functionaries in a community, and so weren't able to kind of dedicate their whole lives, the whole day to pietistic practices in a cloise, but they were able to on Shabbat. They could pray. They had the leisure to pray at greater length, with greater concentration, with greater feeling of inspiration, if they were given the tools to do it. And on a daily basis, they could infuse their daily practices with a greater consciousness of God. They can infuse their business activities with a greater consciousness of God. And also, these are people who are they're in a way they're conflicted, right? They are caught between the worlds of piety and the worlds of real life, of business, of being out there in the world, of being in the marketplace, of travel. And when you're out in the world, there's all kinds of distractions from living a holy, inspired life. So one of the things that Rabbi Shnizam set out to do in the Tanya is to give a set of templates, almost cognitive exercises that you can use to reorientate yourself, to keep yourself on track as you're going through life and encountering these challenges to your service of God. He's using these Hasidic ideas shot through with a rigorous Lurianic Kabbalistic framework, which gives you a theological framework. And he's giving you spiritual tools which are, on the one hand, systematic and rigorous, but also accessible. And the role that ṣimṣum plays in all this, to get back to the original question, really, is that at many key points, when the Alter Rebbe wants to explain to you the significance of a mitzvah, so that you can conceptualize for yourself what it is that why a mitzvah is important, why you should be motivated to fulfill a mitzvah, or why you should be motivated to study the Torah, or what is the nature of the soul. At crucial points, he introduces ṣimṣum, not always using the language of ṣimṣum, but the concept of ṣimṣum in its non-literal form, meaning to say, the idea that we should never understand God to be actually distant from ourselves, but we should always understand that God is present and God is accessible. So how is God accessible, and how can we make God manifest? If he is present, but we don't see him, we are unaware, we're feeling uninspired, how do we make God present to ourselves? How do we acknowledge that presence? How do we make ourselves conscious of that presence? Well, Torah is the way that God's presence becomes manifest. Mitzvahs are a way that God's presence becomes embodied, becomes realized, becomes concrete, not just theoretical in the mind, but actually when you're doing a mitzvah, you're touching God, right? When you hold the esrog, you're holding the divine in your hand, right? So that's in a way, this is like it brings the mystical and it brings the spiritual dimension in direct contact with the individual. And these ideas, these ways of thinking about the nature of a mitzvah, the nature of Torah, that he says that when you study Torah, your mind is united with God in a manner of union that cannot be compared to anything else. It's the most sublime form of union because your thought and God's thought are literally one thought. So you're thinking the thoughts of God. Right? So that's a very profound idea, which depends fundamentally on the notion that ṣimṣum should not be understood literally. If ṣimṣum is understood literally, then God's thoughts far transcend anything that we can understand, anything that we can ever hope to understand, because God is beyond the world entirely. But if we understand that ṣimṣum is not to be understood literally, that God is in fact present in the world, and we just need to find the right means to connect, to enter into a relationship with God, so then the picture is entirely transformed. Then we can understand our thoughts to be God's thoughts when we study Torah. We can understand our actions to be an extension of God. The arm that wraps tefillin is fulfilling the will, is manifesting the will of God. The supernal will of God is being realized in your body, through your body. So you become, in Kabbalistic terminology, a merkava, a vehicle for the will of God, something that is not other than God, something that is utterly transparent to God. So the mystical experience of Hasidism and the sense of God's presence, which is central to the arguments and to the techniques, the spiritual techniques explained in the Tanya all depend on the non-literal interpretation of ṣimṣum.
Rabbi Rubin, you mentioned before that one of the issues that this whole topic grapples with is the holy and the profane, or perhaps it's the holy and the unholy. How did the Balatanya, how did this thinking, did that redefine that potential gap, or is simply the Balatanya saying, whatever you use, whether Torah, a mitzvah, relationship, whatever you use, um, can become holy depending on how you use it and what your intention is. That still leaves room, obviously, for the unholy and for the profane.
Yeah. Well, in the last 3 chapters of the Tanya, he actually asked this question directly. He says, if God is everywhere in all things, so the whole notion of the Kodesh HaKadoshim, the whole notion that there's a Holy of Holies, seems very, very strange. Why is God in the Holy of Holies more than in any other place? And his response to that question is that there's a distinction to be made between presence and revelation. Holiness is about the revelation of God. Where God is not revealed, God is present, but God is present in the unholiness. So when a person sins, he has this very almost visceral parable that when a person sins, it's like taking the head of the king and thrusting it into the dunghill. Right? So when you sin, it's not that God is somewhere else. God is with you, and you're dragging God into this unholy, filthy place. So this doesn't, instead of, as some people might have feared, that the idea of God being present undoes the idea of holiness and undoes the whole notion of religion, the whole notion of something of a distinction between the good and the bad, between a mitzvah and a sin. On the contrary, this actually intensifies our understanding of the magnitude of what it is to sin. If God is somewhere else, if God is not really is so transcendent as not to be present in the world at all, so do your sins really matter? Does God really care? But if you understand God to be present, to be with you in everything that you do, so then when you sin, not only does it matter to God, you're compromising God's own self. You're bringing God into the realm of unholiness. What greater sacrilege could there be? Right, so this really intensifies the magnitude of what it is to sin, and also correspondingly the magnitude of what it is to do a mitzvah. If you understand a mitzvah to be an embrace of God, a revelation of God, in this in a way that it is not just a kind of glimmer of the divine who will always remain beyond you, but actually does bring the divine self into a direct relationship with the human self, that intensifies the significance, the wonder, the gratitude that we should have to be able to do a mitzvah. So yes, so he does directly address this question of the holy and the profane, and the way he approaches it is through this crucial distinction between revelation and presence. God can be present, and that doesn't make the thing that God is present in holy. The question is that thing transparent to God? Is that thing channeling God, allowing God to be manifest? Or is it denying, preventing God from being manifest? And he goes so far as to say that every mitzvah can be reduced to either a fulfillment of the first commandment, I am Hashem your God, and every transgression or non-fulfillment of a mitzvah is a transgression of the second commandment, have no other gods before you. Because as soon as you have asserted that, as soon as you are doing something other than the will of God, you are denying God. You're preventing God from being manifest. So that's a fundamental, almost a denial of God's presence. The denial of God's presence is the ultimate sin. And the denial of God's presence is the concealment of God's presence. You're saying God is not manifest here. Here, I'm going to do what I want to do. Well, that's the gravest sin, right? So are you revealing God? Are you making God manifest? Or are you getting in the way?
So I'm walking on the street, and I've been walking and walking and walking, and I'm extremely tired. And then all of a sudden, from nowhere, I see a bench, and I say, "Ugh, I'm sitting on this bench, and I'm thanking God. I'm thanking Hashem for this bench." And I realize that somehow it's as if from heaven this bench came down for me so that I could rest because I'm on my way to do something important and profound. So no one would say that that bench is holy, that it's kadosh, because kedusha, holiness, has very precise definitions. So what is that bench now in this whole thinking? It's not a
Right.
revelation, but it's a means to.
Right. Well, let's think about it slightly differently. Let's give a slightly different analogy. Let's say
Okay,
when you sit on that bench, you take out a chumash and you start studying. Right. So
okay,
now you're not just using the bench to rest your weary legs, but you're also using it to in service of the mitzvah of studying Torah. Now, somebody walks along and sees this pious man studying with such dedication. Well, that makes it Kiddush Hashem, right? So you in that moment are manifesting God's presence in the world, and the bench is an accessory to that, right? So the bench is now part of a picture, right? When you look at this corner of the world, you see the divine manifest, right? Why? Because it's being used in a way that allows its own existence as a piece of wood to recede into the background and allow its divine purpose to come to the fore, right? Whereas if somebody was using that bench for some nefarious purpose, so then that little corner of the world would be a place where God was not being manifest, right?
okay. Rabbi Rubin, Dr. Rubin, you write in the book about the rupture of modernity. Um, what does that mean? How does that relate to the concept of ṣimṣum? And if I understand correctly, you also, Rabbi, would make the argument that something was happening in the world at that time that we're talking about now, the Enlightenment, modernity. How is that all connected if you're looking at history?
Right. Yeah,
I know
this is
That's,
one of
that's a couple.
the
I know that's a number of questions in one, but okay.
yeah. So the question of modernity, I put it in the title, and it's one of the underlying questions of the book. Um, the question of modernity is a question that scholars have been grappling with. We all have a sense, we've had a sense for a long time, that at some point in the 16th century, something changed. And there have been all kinds of ways, and we call it modernity, right? So there's the early modern period, there's the late modern period. Some people say we're now in a postmodern period, but modernity has been this term by which humankind, for the last several hundred years, have used to think about themselves in juxtaposition to whatever came before. And the question is, well, what did change, in fact? Um, and some people have given technological explanations. You know, it's the age of print. Um, Later on, we have increased means of transportation. A little later, we also have, the new feats of engineering, new developments in science. We have the Industrial Revolution comes along. These are all part of modernity, but they also seem quite dissatisfying in many ways because you can always point to counterexamples, pockets which we would already think of as modern and yet didn't have these technologies yet, or places that did have these technology, like China, which had print much earlier than Europe, and which we don't think of as being part of modernity in that era. So others have come with more kind of intellectual, conceptual approaches. And what I'm trying to do in this book is to explore maybe a third way, rather than treating it purely in conceptual terms, in terms of enlightenment, secularization, which most of these theories don't stand up to sustained examination, especially like the secularization thesis. Most of the early modern thinkers were religious. Isaac Newton was profoundly religious in his outlook. He might have been thinking about religion slightly differently to what was conventional in England at the time. But to say that he was secular is simply false. And the same goes for other great Enlightenment thinkers. Leibniz was also a very religious, spiritual kind of thinker. So theology was actually very important to modernity. New theologies were important. Debates over theology were part and parcel of modernity. So, in short, the argument I make is that modernity is a kind of existential condition. It's a certain recognition of an underlying rupture in being itself. So whereas in earlier periods, there was a kind of a sense that the world and God was a kind of seamless whole. That the world, let's say, flowed out of God in a kind of, to use the Neoplatonistic frame, where God is the unmoved mover and the world, creation, beings kind of flow out from the more sublime to the less sublime. And there is no fundamental break. There's no point in which you can say, here, God made a decision, right? Right? The whole notion of the unmoved mover is that God is unmoved. God is, in a way, very distant from creation, but also not very distant at all, because there's no gap between God and creation. There's no fundamental breach between the creator and the created. In fact, in the pre-modern period, when people think about God, they think about God solely in relationship to creation, God as creator, as an explanation of how creation comes about. The pagan notions of God are also uh, the God of this, the God of that, right? The God of, let's say, the God of rain, the God of light, the God of war. These are human concerns, right? And so this is thinking about the divine very much as part and parcel of the world and of the human realm. In the modern period, I argue, this changes. Which suddenly, the prime example is Descartes, who posits a complete rupture between spirit and matter. So spirit is the spiritual realm, the divine realm, and matter is the material, mechanistic realm. And to say that these are two completely different sorts of thing, to the point that we have to come up with some explanation of how they might interact, this is a radical new way of thinking. And more specifically, for the purposes of this book, I make the argument that Descartes was not the first to think in this way. The first to think in this way was the Arizal, with his new notion of ṣimṣum, which, as I explained earlier, is a rupture between God and the world, is a removal of God from the world, whether a removal of God's self or a removal of God's revelation. It's saying that the notion of ṣimṣum introduces God in a new way. God is not the creator, fundamentally. In order for God to create, he's got to undergo this fundamental change, this process called ṣimṣum, to become the creator. Before that, God exists, but not as creator. God is this fundamentally different being, this fundamentally transcendent being, this infinite being that we can't conceive of at all in human terms. Right? So this is a new idea introduced by the Arizal, and it starts popping up all over Europe in the next 100 years. First of all, the Lurianic Kabbalah is being disseminated in Latin translation, first in manuscripts and then actually published. There's some Lurianic writings that appear in Latin translation before they appear in Hebrew. So in Hebrew, in print, right? They're in Hebrew manuscript, but they're not published in books. So this new way of thinking about God, this new theology, is being read across Europe. I don't know if Descartes knew about Lurianic Kabbalah. He might have been a little too early. He's after the Arizal, but perhaps too young for these ideas have come to him directly. But there's and so I'm not making a claim really about influence, certainly not in the case of Descartes. And I'm not also, and neither am I making a case about influence going the other way. I don't think that the Hasidic masters were aware that Isaac Newton had read Lurianic Kabbalah, or that they were of Isaac Newton's ideas, or Descartes, or any of these figures. But somehow, in this period, in the 16th century, and then in the 17th century, the specifically in the 17th century, you have this enormous spread of Kabbalistic ideas and of ideas that resonate in this kind of way. And when I say Kabbalistic ideas, I mean specifically Lurianic ideas, ideas of rupture, that we need to think about God and the relationship between God and reality in a new way through this prism of rupture, that there's a distinction between God and the world. And then how do we interpret that distinction? Does that distinction empty the world of divinity, which is where the Cartesian paradigm leads, or does it mean that we need to think about the way that God is manifest in the world in a different way, in a more dynamic way? Because part of the distinction is that if God is fundamentally beyond being a creator, so then creation is a choice. It doesn't, the created realms don't flow out of God naturally. God has to decide to create the world. Well, so what does that mean? Why does God decide to create the world? So this opens up a whole new kind of discourse with new kinds of questions, all of which center on this existential rupture. And this comes back to the distinction between the sacred and the profane, the holy and the unholy. How you negotiate, how you interpret this rupture between the holy and the unholy determines the shape of your religious practice, your theology, and also the way you think about the world. Is the world standing? Is it a problem? Is physicality a religious problem that we should try and overcome, ascend beyond? Or is it a function of the divine with divine purpose? Right? Is it something emptied of divinity, or is it something that is saturated with divinity? And the question then becomes, how do you make that saturation manifest? Right? So all of these are new kinds of ways of thinking theologically, and also as a result, new ways of thinking about the nature of reality itself.
And was this way of thinking, as we go down from the Balatanya and we go down the line, and I know you spent time obviously in the book discussing it, as we go down the line of the Chabad leaders, does each Chabad leader have their own interpretation? Is there reinterpretation, or is it just an interpretation that's applied to how they view the world and modernity?
Right. So to be clear, I don't know how, I don't think that until the 20th century, I don't think any of the Chabad leaders, maybe at some point in the 19th century, you could make the argument, but earlier than that, in the first half of the 19th century, the end of the 18th century, I don't think the Chabad leaders or the Hasidim were thinking in terms of the category of modernity. I don't think that was a term that they were concerned with consciously, but they were part of modernity. They were thinking modern thoughts. So they are a part of modernity, whether they knew it or not. Later on, they become conscious that the world around them is changing. Technology, the trains come to Russia in the middle of the 19th century. They're already in the age of print, although manuscripts are very important for Chabad throughout the 19th century and into the 20th century as well. But each successive Rebbe is a unique and individual personality. They each have their own mind. They each have their own way of thinking. They each have their own methods, their own literary methods, their own approaches to writing. What is common to all the Chabad rabbis is that they inherit the corpus of Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi, not just the Tanya, but the many discourses that he delivered orally and which were transcribed. Often we have 4 or 5 transcripts of the same discourse. And these were copied, and later by his sons and his grandsons started publishing these originally oral discourses in various compendia, and they took different approaches to editing, to thinking through really what the Alter Rebbe, what their father and grandfather had taught. And so we find, in the first half of the 19th century, we have, I would say, 3 main figures who are successors to Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi, and each had their distinct approach. We have Rabbi Aaron of Shashela, who was a student, a leading disciple of Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi. We have Rabbi Shneur Zalman's son, Rabbi Dovber Shniori, known as the Mittler Rebbe. Both of them are prolific writers and publishers. And as I argue in the book, they are, in some ways, they're kind of dueling intellects. They're both students of the Alter Rebbe, but they have different ways of articulating and understanding the fundamental ideas that Rabbi Shneur Zalman communicated. And so, for example, the Shashela seems much more reticent to think about the paradox of God's infinite essential self being fully present in the world and fully manifest through our Torah study and through our mitzvah observance. He argues that we can only really speak of God after the ṣimṣum, as God makes himself manifest in the limited forms of the 10 Sefirot. There we can start to think about God, because we have the terminology, we have concepts that are coherent, so we can think coherently. But beyond that, we have to kind of rely on faith, or kind of embrace this mystical perception, which is really beyond language. Whereas Rabbi Dovber, who's about 10 years younger than him, at one time they were very close contemporaries, they studied together. But as time went on, we see them diverging intellectually. So for Rabbi Dovber, what is most fundamental is to think about the unthinkable. So even when you're thinking about God in a more coherent, conventional way, using the categories of the 10 Sefirot and so on, he wants you to always bring back the incoherence, the utter sublimity of God's transcendent and infinite self, and remind yourself that when I'm talking about God manifest in this particular way, which God is it? There's only one God. There's the infinite transcendent God. That is what is being manifested. The God that I can't think about, that is beyond thought, that is what is being manifest in this particular way of thinking about God. So he's always, he's highly philosophical, highly, he expounds on Kabbalistic ideas and on the teachings of Rabbi Shneur Zalman in a very, very elaborate, elucidated form. He uses parables, extensive parables, rich parables, to kind of bring the ideas to life, to make them vivid. So he almost like flooding your mind with the coherence, but at the same time, he's always bringing you back. However much you understand, he wants you to see what you understand as a facet of that which is beyond understanding. So he's always kind of holding those two things together. And then we have the third figure from this early period is the Tzemach Tzedek, who's a grandson of Rabbi Shneur Zalman, and who was also a direct disciple of Rabbi Shneur Zalman. He was about 24 or so when his grandfather passed away. And he is almost like an academic scholar in his approach. He's very focused on the text he examines the different transcripts of his grandfather's discourses, and he has clear preferences for certain transcribers. He prizes the transcripts of Rabbi Shneur Zalman's brother, Rabbi Yehuda Leib, as being the most accurate, the closest to the form in which the teachings were originally delivered. And when he adds to those discourses, rather than, as opposed to the Mitzvah Rabbah, who elaborates in his own language with his own parables, he'll take a teaching of his father and explain it, articulate it in a completely new way, using his own language, using his own philosophical terminology. In contrast, the Tzemach Tzedek sticks to the original text, preserves the original form of the discourse, but then adds footnotes, or rather than footnotes, glosses, which are either inserted into the text or in a separate manuscript, but he'll give indications where these notes should go, and these glosses are highly again they have this, they're highly philological. They're concerned with the history of Jewish thought, with the sources, the Lurianic sources, the sources in Midrash. So when the Alter Rebbe would deliver a discourse, he wouldn't usually cite sources. He would just express the ideas. As sometimes he would quote a Maimar Chazal, right, a rabbinic phrase from the Talmud or from the Midrash. He would start with a pasuk. He would use Kabbalistic terminology, but he wouldn't cite chapter and verse for the most part. And what the Tzemach Tzedek does is he brings you back. He situates these teachings within that larger frame of the Jewish intellectual, rabbinic, halachic, and midrashic and Kabbalistic traditions, and he brings all this earlier literature into conversation with what the Alter Rebbe is doing. So in a way, part of what he does is he thinks through, the Kabbalists have a debate on this particular subject. Well, which position is Rabbi Shneur Zalman taking? And he'll do an analysis, and he'll refer to various different discourses where the Alter Rebbe seems to approach it in different ways, and then he'll develop a way of synthesizing them, or he'll ask a question. He'll take two texts by Rabbi Shneur Zalman, and he'll pose a question, Sarachiyah. This requires investigation. How do we take these two positions? How do we reconcile them? Right? So he is a much more kind of deliberative, scholarly, textual thinker. It's almost like he's thinking through writing and through making these textual annotations. So that's the Tzemach Tzedek, and he's very steeped in the earlier traditions of Jewish philosophy, what's known as Chakira, texts like the Kuzari, or Moreh Nevuchim, Chovos Halevavos, and he's constantly referring, and similarly with the classics of the Lurianic corpus, and he's constantly referring back to those texts and interpreting Rabbi Shneur Zalman's teachings, or sometimes problematizing them, questioning them, right, exploring them through, especially through a philosophical lens, but also through a broader kind of midrashic literary lens as well.
And as we move down, without obviously the book will cover all the leaders of Chabad. As we come down to the Rebbe, the Ramash, how does the Ramash interpret ṣimṣum in the context of modernity, and how did that play out in just the unprecedented global scope of what the Rebbe and Chabad has done in the last 50 years?
Right. Well, just before coming to Ramash, I want to say one more thing about
Please.
the Tzemach Tzedek and modernity,
Yes.
because that I think is an important bridge to help us get to Ramash and help us understand the flow, the historical flow. The Tzemach Tzedek lived in the time where Haskalah, was the so-called Jewish Enlightenment, was encroaching from the West, from Germany, further into the East, into the Russian Empire in various ways. And we have Haskalah literature, we have Haskalah newspapers. And one of the fascinating things is that the Haskalah, the leading figures of the Haskalah, many Haskalah writers had even though they didn't like Hasidism in general, they had a soft spot, as it were, for the Tzemach Tzedek. And this is all the more surprising considering that the Tzemach Tzedek was one of the leaders of the fight against Haskalah. He fought for the preservation of the traditional Jewish educational systems against the encroachments of Linenthal, and there was a kind of government-led campaign to reform Jewish education with a really a secularizing and really a Christianizing agenda at its core, to kind of make the Jews, to kind of domesticate the Jewish population and make them closer to the civilized Christians, right? And so the Tzemach Tzedek really fought very hard against this. But many Haskalah writers write about the Tzemach Tzedek with respect. Some of them even write about having visited him and met him. And part of that was because of his engagement in this very rigorous way with the Jewish philosophical tradition. And part of this also has to do with a kind of intellectual fearlessness that the Tzemach Tzedek displayed, and which was inherited by his son, the Rebbe Maharash. They were not afraid of modernity. They were not afraid of ideas. They were not afraid of philosophy. So they may have been opposed to secularization, but they were not scared to. They were not scared of thinking new thoughts and engaging with the new ideas that were emerging out of science or out of contemporary philosophies. Sometimes they did that more indirectly, sometimes more directly. But in the case of the Rebbe Maharash, he is a thoroughly modern figure. He lives in Lubavitch, which is a shtetl in the Russian Empire. But by this time, you can travel by train to Europe, which he does, and you can read newspapers and journals which are being mailed from Europe. People say that he was able to read Latin or Latin languages, French, German, and so on. But what we know with certainty is that he was also reading scientific journals that were being published at the time in Hebrew. And he seems to have been, even where he's not confronting or thinking about modern ideas, contemporaneous philosophical trends, explicitly, when you read his discourses, there is a sense, there's a feeling that he's thinking in very contemporaneous terms. So the central example is his turn towards a metaphysics of materialism. So Eliyahu Stern, a professor at Yale, has written a book about it's called Jewish Materialism, about Jewish intellectuals in the 1870s, which is exactly this period of the Rebbe Maharash. And he shows that Jewish intellectuals in the Russian Empire, including some who were quite close to Chabad, and including some who Maharash was reading their publications, were very directly concerned with this question of materialism, which was a byproduct of the new Darwinian philosophy. The idea that the world kind of runs on some kind of mechanistic system, and there's a kind of valorization of nature, of the world itself, which almost displaces metaphysics. Science comes to displace metaphysics. But what the Rebbe Maharash is doing is he's developing a metaphysics of materialism. So he's putting the material world on a pedestal in a way that no prior Chabad thinkers had ever done, although he's very much rooted he's in earlier Chabad sources, but he's using them and expressing them in ways that are much more explicit, much more directly concerned with the reality of the material world and the significance of the material world in a way that hadn't been done before. So we see here a trajectory from the Tzemach Tzedek through the Rebbe Maharash to increased engagement with modernity. For the Rebbe Rashab, he's an ultra-conservative figure on the one hand, but he's also deeply engaged with the new questions of his moment. He's deeply aware of the political instability in Russia at the time, and which is to a great degree driven by intellectual concerns, by new philosophies, by new ideologies, and he does battle both on the political front and also on the intellectual front. He really rebuilds Chabad philosophy into a new modern philosophy centered on the idea of rupture and the idea of innovation. So although he's a conservative figure, he sees innovation as a spiritual ideal and something that he wants to put in the service of traditional Judaism. So he wants to bring a new conception, a new idea, a new way of thinking about what it is to be a traditional Jew, which is one of profound cosmic innovation and creativity. So that all leads to, in the post-revolutionary period, Ramash is, I feel like it's almost silly to say that he's a fascinating figure because so many people are obviously fascinated by him, and it becomes almost like a truism, But I genuinely find Ramash fascinating as a person, and he goes to Berlin in the late 1920s, and this is a moment where you have the Hildesheimer Seminary, where it's the beginning of modern Jewish studies within an Orthodox context. So you have what's called Wissenschaft des Judentums, the Wissenschaft school which is really associated with Reform Judaism in Germany in the 19th century. But in this early part of the 20th century, you have a Wissenschaft school that's Orthodox. And Ramash he's enrolled in the Hildesheimer Seminary. We don't know how much time he spent there, but he certainly engaged with the people there, with certain faculty members and certain other students at the Hildesheimer Seminary. So he's aware of this new way of studying Torah, really, right? Which is scientific, which uses bibliographies. He actually stays in the house of a Chabad Hasid who had become an academic and was working on a critical edition of Sefer HaRikma, which is a medieval, I think, work of grammar. And so he's in the house where this Chabad. I don't think he considered himself a Chassid at the time, but he was from a very illustrious Chassidic family. His name was Wilensky, Michal Wilensky, and later on the Rebbe actually, once they had both come to America, the Rebbe helped raise funds to publish a second edition of this work, Harikma. So he's very aware of these new trends, and we see in his own method, just like the Tzemach Tzedek, like I said before, was using a kind of scholarly, almost academic method. We see great similarities in the case of Ramash. From a very early period, he's working on indices. He adds footnotes to his father-in-law's discourses. So we see the modes. He's adopting the modes of scholarly discourse, the tools of the scientific academy, and he's bringing them into the fold of Hasidic literature in Chabad's official publications, even before he's Rebbe. The other important thing that's happening for Ramash in this period, in terms of modernity, is that he attends the lectures of Schrödinger, who's developing quantum theory. So he has a front row seat for these new developments in physics, which he would understand as a complete revolution, not only in science, but in philosophy. One of his teachers was a fellow called Reichenbach, who was he started out as a mathematician, I think. He became a philosopher of science. He was a protege of Einstein. And what he was trying to do was he was trying to work out a new philosophy that would accord with the new science. And he wrote very clearly, he was of the opinion that the old philosophy just didn't hold up. The certain fundamental principles that philosophers had always assumed as axiomatic, like causality, if something happens, there must be something that's causing it to happen. And which underlies the whole kind of materialistic, mechanistic worldview, is that one event triggers another event, which triggers another event. And if you have a proper picture of reality, you can predict with precision exactly how this mechanistic series of events is going to unfold. Well, the new physics completely undid that, and on the quantum level, everything becomes a matter of probability rather than certainty. So nothing is. There is no precise mechanism by which you can predict what's going to happen next. Things kind of pop out into being out of a field of possibilities, right? So these ideas, again, Ramash had a front row seat as these ideas were being worked out both by the physicists, the leading physicists of the era, and by the philosophers who were closest to those physicists and who were really grappling with these new philosophical questions. And I make the argument that these concerns and this intellectual revolution is reflected in the way Ramash would later, many decades later, would revisit the axioms of Chabad thought, and even sometimes, throw the axioms of Chabad thought into question, much in the same way that the new physics had thrown the fundamentals of philosophy more generally into question. Ramash was throwing open the re-examining the fundamentals of Hasidic thought in a very radical way, and at the same time, he understood and showed that these new developments create new opportunities, new intellectual opportunities. It's not just a challenge. It's not just that the old systems are thrown out, but now actually we have new conceptual frameworks which we can use to uphold, to rethink the fundamentals of Judaism, to rethink the fundamental dogmas of Judaism. So on the one hand, one of the things I talk about is how he's using some of these new conceptual paradigms to uphold dogma while keeping interpretive frameworks open. So on the one hand, we have, let's say, the 13 principles of faith, right? We have certain fundamentals that traditional Jewish theology always wants to be loyal to. On the other hand, how do you uphold them in the face of a changing scientific picture or a changing picture in contemporaneous philosophy? And this is one of the things that it was a challenge that Ramash, more than anyone else perhaps, was equipped. He had the right tools, he had the right training, the right exposure to both understand the challenge and also meet the challenge. And so we have, for example, if we talk about ṣimṣum, going back to this fundamental Chabad dogma, as it were, that ṣimṣum should not be interpreted literally, Ramash throws that question open again and argues for a more open framework in which we can countenance both a non-literal and a literal interpretation of ṣimṣum without homogenizing them, without reducing the differences between them. But if we have a more sophisticated conceptual framework, then we can also entertain competing ideas that might have previously appeared to be mutually exclusive can actually be held together if we have the conceptual elasticity, as it were, to think in new ways. And this is something which I think he was quite indebted to Reichenbach, who also was making the case that it's not just that old philosophies do not correspond anymore to the new physics, but the new physics provides new ways of thinking in which things that were previously problematic might no longer be problematic because we have a new conceptual framework. And so the whole, as it was, the mathematics, or the equations look different once you put them into this new framework. And so things that might have, you might have said previously, that there can only be a kind of mechanistic outcome, which can only produce one result. Well, in the quantum field, there are many different mutually exclusive possibilities, which are all contained within that system. And so that's mirrored in the way Ramash is doing theology.
In conclusion, Kabbalah and the Rupture of Modernity, titled An Existential History of Chabad Hasidism. Obviously, when is the book coming out?
The publication date is March 25th, but I
okay.
that people are already receiving volumes.
March 25th. Okay, and that's Stanford University Press. Obviously, the work is rigorously academic on the one hand. Okay, Stanford University Press, et cetera, et cetera. Do you also see it as a book that could be part of Chabad literature? In other words, is this something that could be put into Hebrew and Yiddish and be published, or put into Kahat publishing? Or do you see this book as a book of Musar in some ways as well? How do you define the book?
That's a really interesting question. I mean, certainly on one level, I do think it is part of Chabad literature. I'm a member of the Chabad community. I work at Chabad.org, so I'm very firmly in that world. But
you didn't publish it through
I didn't
Chabad.
publish it through that partly because I think the tools of the academy they provide ways and frameworks of thinking about things that are coherent or what's the word I'm looking for? They provide a framework, an intellectual framework to think about things in ways that are different, unconventional, which first of all, that forced me to work harder in terms of really thinking, because when you're part of a tradition of religious thought and you study and you understand, it's easy to repeat what you've heard from your teachers without making it your own. And so on a personal level, there's multiple motivations for writing such a book. But one motivation was simply to bring Chabad ideas to a larger audience. But another motivation, maybe a more personal one, is that I really wanted to understand these ideas myself. And as somebody living, in the 21st century, to really understand something, you need to understand it in contemporary terms, in your own language, in a language that is not just an inherited language, in a language that you're not just repeating from others, but in a language that allows you to revisit, almost similar to what I was saying before about Ramash, revisiting the fundamentals in a way that allows you to see them much more clearly. So, on the other hand, in doing so, I'm kind of mediating between these two worlds. I'm not just coming from the Chabad world to the academic world. I'm also, almost by default, that creates a kind of two-way street by which academic concepts, academic modes of thought, academic methods are going to be, to some degree, more within the awareness of the Chabad community, and that's already the case. The Chabad community is very engaged in the world outside of Chabad, very engaged. Communication is fundamental to Chabad's ethos from the very beginning. Communicating in language that can be understood. So, some people might think that academics use arcane language that is more difficult to understand. But my hope is that actually the tools of the academy and the language of the academy can make these ideas more real, more alive, more accessible, and bring them out of kind of the abstract code language that we often, in the world of the Chabad yeshiva, we might sometimes just be over-reliant on certain key words without probing, well, what does this really mean? So now, can it be translated into Hebrew? Again, it's a book that's written in a particular kind of style. It's in a style that might not doesn't fit coherently. The genre is not the genre of a sefer. But I've thought about it. I'd like to be able to take the ideas here and convert them into a format and into a language that would be accessible. Not so much accessible, but legible, in terms of the ordinary genres, the genre of the sefer, of the holy book, that sits on, you can see behind me.
You're bridging the gap. You're bridging the gap.
I'm trying to bridge that gap. And also another thing is that I didn't write it only with academics in mind. I wrote it with a larger audience of intelligent English speakers, English readers in mind. So, you don't need to be an academic to read this book. I'm trying to tell a story about ideas. And when I do use academic terminology, I try and explain what the terminology is doing, what it means before I use it or as I'm using it. Sometimes there are academic terms which are useful shorthand, but I don't want to just rely on it as shorthand and assume that you know what it means. I want to probe these terms, just like I'm probing the Hasidic terms. Right? So you could say the word ṣimṣum and assume that everyone knows what ṣimṣum means, but I'm probing that and I'm trying to examine it from multiple different perspectives. Like I begin the book with Durkheim and try and explain ṣimṣum using a kind of sociological prism, partly because I think that allows people who live in the world and understand basic concepts, basic social concepts, just because they're part of their lives. Right? Everyone has a concept of the holy and the profane in some way or another, right? Everyone has something that is sacred to them, something that's special to them, right? So these are concepts that are kind of universal concepts, and I want to show how they relate to the Kabbalistic terms, and thereby help a wider audience, people who are not experts on Kabbalah, who are not experts on the history of Hasidism or on the history of modernity, but are intelligent, thinking people who are interested in religion, who are interested in science, who are interested in modernity, who are interested in what it means to be a human being in the world, to make these ideas relevant and accessible, to show really how they are relevant, and they're already part of their lives in some ways that they might not be aware of.
We urge all of our thinking listeners and viewers to check out Rabbi Dr. Rubin's Kabbalah and the Rupture of Modernity. They can always go online at chabad.org and other sites to read Rabbi Dr. Rubin's works, and should continue to go from strength to strength, from chayil to chayil. Thank you so much for today's discussion. We appreciate it very much.
Thank you very much. I'll just add that if you order directly from the press, from Stanford, using the code Rupture20, you can get 20% off.
Excellent.
So,
okay, we'll put that up.
Enjoy.
Thank you. Okay.
Thank you so much. This was great.
Thank you.